The history of East Africa is incomplete without addressing the infamous figure of Tippu Tip, a man whose name became synonymous with the brutalities of the slave trade and the exploitation of Central Africa's human and natural resources. Born Ahmad bin Muhammad bin Juma bin Rajab el Murjibi in 1837 in Zanzibar, Tippu Tip would later become one of the most feared and powerful men in East Africa, leaving a legacy of unimaginable suffering, plunder, and domination. His rise to power was not merely a product of political acumen or military prowess, but one fueled by a ruthless and dehumanizing approach to trade, conquest, and slavery. This first part will explore his origins, his early brutal exploits, and the broader historical context that allowed his reign of terror to flourish. Tippu Tip was born into a well-established Swahili trading family, with connections to the Omani Arab elite who had effectively turned Zanzibar into the epicenter of the East African slave trade. The island was a commercial hub, where the wealth of Arab, Indian, and African traders was built largely on the backs of enslaved Africans. This laid the foundation for Tippu Tip's future empire. His early life was steeped in a world where human lives were commodities, valued only for their ability to produce wealth through labor or as objects for sale in distant markets. From a young age, Tippu Tip was exposed to the violent realities of the slave trade, where the capture, transportation, and sale of people were everyday occurrences. The brutality of the slave trade in East Africa was multifaceted, involving not just the capture and sale of individuals, but also the complete destruction of entire communities. Slave raids would often involve the wholesale slaughter of those deemed unfit for sale, leaving behind a trail of devastation and ruin. Tippu Tip's early participation in these raids was instrumental in shaping his worldview, one in which human life had little intrinsic value beyond its economic utility. His initial forays into slave trading involved capturing people from the interior regions of Central Africa and transporting them to the coastal markets of Zanzibar, where they would be sold to Arab, European, and Indian buyers. This period of Tippu Tip's life is marked by an increasing level of involvement in the dehumanizing machinery of the slave trade, not just as a participant but as an innovator. Tippu Tip quickly realized that in order to increase his profits and expand his influence, he would need to control not just the trade routes but the people who live along them. His early ventures into Central Africa were characterized by extreme violence, where the subjugation of local populations through terror and force became his primary method of operation. Villages were razed, crops were burned, and anyone who resisted was either killed or enslaved. The brutality with which Tippu Tip conducted these operations earned him a fearsome reputation, and his name became synonymous with death and destruction across vast swathes of Central Africa. Tippu Tip's early success as a slave trader and merchant allowed him to expand his operations deeper into Central Africa, particularly into the Congo Basin, a region rich in both human and natural resources. The Congo had long been a target for Arab and Swahili traders, but it was Tippu Tip who truly brought the region under his control. His method was simple. He would establish alliances with local chiefs, offering them guns and other trade goods in exchange for their assistance in capturing slaves and extracting ivory. These chiefs, eager to gain the upper hand over their rivals, would often agree to Tippu Tip's terms, effectively becoming vassals in his growing empire. However, these alliances were often short-lived, as Tippu Tip had no qualms about betraying his partners once they had outlived their usefulness. In many cases, Tippu Tip would orchestrate conflicts between rival tribes, providing weapons to both sides in order to weaken them. Once both sides were sufficiently weakened, he would sweep in with his own forces, capturing slaves and seizing ivory for himself. This strategy of divide and conquer allowed Tippu Tip to rapidly expand his influence, while simultaneously keeping the local populations too fractured and weakened to resist his rule. The sheer scale of violence and destruction that accompanied Tippu Tip's expansion into the Congo is difficult to overstate. Entire communities were wiped off the map, their people either killed or sold into slavery, while the survivors were left to rebuild their lives under the constant threat of further raids. The dehumanizing nature of Tippu Tip's empire was not limited to the slave trade. As he expanded his operations into the Congo, he became increasingly involved in the extraction of ivory, which was in high demand in Europe and the Middle East. The methods used to extract ivory were no less brutal than those used to capture slaves. Large hunting parties would be sent into the forest to track down and kill elephants, often using local populations as forced labor to carry the tusks back to the coast. Those who refused to cooperate were either killed or enslaved, and entire villages were often destroyed in the process. The toll that Tippu Tip's ivory hunts took on the local environment and wildlife was catastrophic, with entire elephant populations being wiped out in certain areas. Tippu Tip's expansion into the Congo also brought him into conflict with European powers, particularly Belgium, which was in the process of establishing its own colonial empire in the region under the leadership of King Leopold II. The Belgian Congo would eventually become one of the most infamous examples of European colonial brutality, but Tippu Tip's reign of terror in the region predates even the worst excesses of Leopold's regime. The competition between Tippu Tip and the Belgians for control of the Congo's resources would eventually lead to a series of violent clashes, further escalating the already dire situation for the region's inhabitants. The psychological impact of Tippu Tip's reign on the people of Central Africa was immense. For those who were captured and sold into slavery, the journey from the interior to the coast was a harrowing experience. Captives were often chained together in long lines, forced to march for weeks or even months through dense forests and treacherous terrain. Those who could not keep up with the pace were beaten or left to die, while others were killed outright to prevent them from slowing down the group. The constant threat of violence, combined with the physical and emotional trauma of being torn from their homes and families, left deep scars on the people who survived Tippu Tip's raids. For those who managed to escape capture, life was no less perilous. The constant threat of slave raids forced many communities to live in a state of perpetual fear, with people abandoning their homes and villages to seek refuge in more remote areas. Some attempted to resist Tippu Tip's forces, but these efforts were almost always met with brutal reprisals. Entire villages were often destroyed in retaliation for any act of resistance, with the survivors being sold into slavery or forced to flee into the wilderness. The sheer scale of the destruction wrought by Tippu Tip's empire left many parts of Central Africa in a state of chaos and depopulation, with entire regions being reduced to wastelands of abandoned villages and ruined crops. The dehumanizing nature of Tippu Tip's empire extended to every aspect of life for the people under his rule. For those who were captured and sold into slavery, their lives were reduced to mere commodities, valued only for their ability to produce wealth for their captors. The conditions in which they were forced to live and work were often brutal, with little regard for their health or well-being. Many were worked to death in plantations or mines, while others were subjected to cruel and inhumane treatment at the hands of their masters. The psychological toll of this dehumanization was immense, with many enslaved people being driven to despair by the hopelessness of their situation. As Tippu Tip's empire grew, so too did the scale of the brutality that he unleashed upon Central Africa. His willingness to use violence and terror as tools of control and domination made him one of the most feared men in the region, and his legacy of dehumanization and exploitation would leave a lasting mark on the history of East and Central Africa. However, Tippu Tip's reign of terror was far from over, and the next phase of his life would see him expand his influence even further, as he sought to consolidate his power and wealth through even more brutal means.